ahead. Coming up after this break.
Terror strikes in Never Never Land.
In the early years, British businessmen made large investments in Hong Kong. They wanted to develop the colony as a trading base. But up north, the Qing government was forced to open more ports in China. This affected Hong Kong's status and development. About a dozen or so years after the British took over Hong Kong, southern China became engulfed in a rebellion. Armed troops of triads went on the rampage against the Qing government, forcing many more mainlanders to flee to Hong Kong. Unlike earlier settlers, many of these refugees came from wealthy families.
In the Pearl River Delta, there was this kind of the Triads rebellion. And after this Triads rebellion, there were unrest in the South China area. And some of the wealthy Chinese at that time decided to move over to Hong Kong. And so in Hong Kong, we have the first batch of wealthy Chinese, what they consider as respectable Chinese.
During this time, the United States and Australia were hit by a gold fever. The prospects for riches drew many more Chinese to leave China via Hong Kong for North America and the South Seas. This boosted Hong Kong as an entrepot.
Some of the very clever merchants in Hong Kong, they developed this kind of what we call the Nam Bak Hong trade. They export items coming from mainland China and basically foodstuffs, and they ship it to North America to satisfy the needs of the Chinese over there.
The Nam Bak or South North Hongs still thrive in Sheung Wan today. In the early days, they specialized in re-exporting Chinese foodstuff, medicine, and daily appliances to the overseas workers. Chinese traders who came south to Hong Kong, such as the family of Sir Kenneth Fung, opened a string of companies, including a native bank and South North Trading Hongs. Sir Kenneth says his ancestors had a difficult time in the beginning.
都好艱難啊，步步為營啊，我哋做南北行，中國式啊，講信字啊，揸住個算盤仔咁，你想買我呢幫貨呢咁啊，大家佢同我兩個咁，我賣手你啊買家咁啊，第啲人喺書都睇唔到嘅，揸。
However, when interviewed in English, Sir Kenneth said it was not hard to start a business.
Was it difficult for people like your father to start business in Hong Kong?
No problem at all. It's, even in those days, all free trade except opium and dutiable things like cigarettes and all the other things, no problem.
Some of the early Chinese traders, such as Li Xing, started in banking and then bought property.
有好多限制㗎，
即係早期如果你要響中環啲深嗰度唔得㗎，
嗰度就係佢哋嘅即係唔屬於環嘅地方，即係所以我哋就算沿海咧，都係用嗰啲倉地同埋嗰啲地方就發展我哋自己嘅環嘅鋪頭。
So the Chinese settled in Sheung Wan and Western District. As they prospered, they managed to buy land in the city centre. For a time, the peak down to the mid-levels were reserved for Europeans. Only when the Chinese attained higher economic status were they allowed in. The first person with Chinese blood to live on the peak was Sir Robert Ho-tung.
No written rule, but they all know that we can't go there. We can't live up in the peak. Sir Robert Ho-tung later on managed to own properties up in the peak. He was the exception.
Trailing the Ho-tungs, more and more Chinese started buying land in the mid-levels.
My father bought his house in Robinson Road. That's how we're up to the peak.
Gradually, traders from China took root and became a force to be reckoned with in Hong Kong. In 1881, the 8th Hong Kong governor, Sir John Pope Hennessy, had this to say.
So much of the commercial life is conducted by the Chinese, where the wealthiest merchants are Chinese, where the Chinese possess so much property, where they are the permanent inhabitants, and where 9/10 of the government revenues are contributed by them.
The British and some wealthy Chinese lived an affluent lifestyle, but most of the other Chinese still lived in poverty, and the government did little about it.
The Chinese live in very poor conditions in the Taiping Shan area, and the government didn't do anything to improve the living condition. The sanitation was very poor and the water was unclean.
The whole philosophy of government in those days, not only in the colony but at in the metropolitan government as well, that the sense of welfare actually was very, very limited. Right. Secondly, in Hong Kong, it worked on a very tight budget, and the colonial government was given to understand that the British government would not subsidize them in any way. So they were on their own, they have to rely on their own resources.
It fell to some influential Chinese to take up the banner for their less fortunate compatriots. Community leaders led by Li Xing and Leung Wan Hon raised funds to build the first hospital of Chinese medicine. That was the Tung Wah Hospital.
呢啲相咧，如果大家知道個歷史嘅話咧，就好有趣嘅，因為呢度咧係包羅咗由1870年到依家整個華人社會裏邊最有影響力嘅人，亦都幾乎包括咗香港最有錢嘅華人㗎啦。
Tung Wah Hospital was established in 1870. Besides dispensing medical services, it acted as a spokesman for the masses, which were isolated from the government, and it became their standard bearer. The government started to take note of the Chinese. In 1880, Governor Sir John Pope Hennessy appointed Wu Ting-fang into the Legislative Council. He was the first Chinese to enter Hong Kong's political arena. But relations between the Chinese and the expatriates took a turn for the worst over the leasing of the new territories. In 1898, Britain forced a weakened Qing government to lease the new territories for 99 years. Beijing acquiesced, but the indigenous rural residents were against the lease and took up arms to resist the British troops. Military records depict a fierce battle on the slopes of Sheung village, with the native residents wielding primitive weapons to repel the modern guns of Britain's forces. One conflict was fought here at Gat Hing Wai.
英軍呢，佢用重炮圍攻我哋錦田鄉吉慶圍、泰康圍。喺林村坳咯，條友嗰處嚟噶嘛，
我哋喺三皮啦嘛，最激烈，譬如而家個炮死好多啊！我哋啲人。
This dilapidated Tat Dak village hall in Yuen Long has not been renovated in many years. But inside, memories of the anti-British rebellion are preserved in the inscriptions of names of indigenous residents who had died in the resistance.
In the 19th century, we changed the face of the world. We cannot lose what we have made.
About this time, Dr. Sun Yat-sen was in the throes of his anti-Qing campaign. Dr. Sun went to school in Hong Kong. Those 7 years in the territory influenced his revolutionary thinking. Dr. Sun once said this about Hong Kong.
I wonder how it was that foreigners could achieve so much on a barren rock in a span of 70 to 80 years. Yet after 4,000 years of civilization, China has no place like Hong Kong. Why?
Dr. Sun's revolutionary movement drew much support from the Hong Kong Chinese. A government report at the time noted that the locals not only sympathized with the revolution, they were intensely emotional about it. The Qing dynasty was finally toppled in 1911, and the Republic of China was born. People celebrated across China and in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong government reacted by banning such celebrations and donations to Dr. Sun's cause. The move further infuriated the Chinese. In July 1912, newly appointed Governor Sir Henry May was shot at by a gunman, aggravating an already tense situation between the Chinese and the government. In China, the nationalist government took hold, but soon the nation deteriorated into another period of turmoil. Warlords staked out territories and fought to defend them. Later, nationalist forces were pitched against the emergent communists in an outright civil war. The unrest drove more mainlanders to flee to Hong Kong, swelling the territory's population and filling its streets with the homeless. The colony's economy slumped. In 1938, its population topped 1 million for the first time. But the refugees from Guangdong and Shanghai gave Hong Kong new impetus.
It was only in the year 1949 that it's what we call a turning point in the history of Hong Kong. Because after that, the whole family would move over and actually settled in Hong Kong.
Over the years, the British rulers kept their grip on power as the massive influx continued. But as the mainlanders carved out their niche in the territory, Japan invaded China, and Hong Kong entered another chapter of its history.
The SAR Day Extravaganza. The SAR Day July 1st Reunification Gala in Beijing. Hosted live by Winnie Young, broadcasting live from Beijing tomorrow night at 8:30. Followed by the SAR Day Hong Kong 97 Spectacular. Hosted by Flora Chan and Jeff Wong tomorrow night at 10. History in the making. See it on Pearl.
Welcome again to TVB's live handover coverage. Activists for democracy in Hong Kong out in force at Statue Square this afternoon. And Deborah Kahn is there as well, and she joins us now. Hello, Deborah.
Hello, Chris. Thank you very much. To continue with our series on democracy, it was not until the 1989 student crackdown in Beijing that Hong Kong people mobilized support for its fight for democracy. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of people poured onto the street, calling for more rights.
May I thank you for the privilege of being the silence of
When the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed between Britain and China in 1984, Hong Kong people were promised a high degree of autonomy. The document stated the territory's capitalist system would remain unchanged for 50 years after the handover, and Hong Kong would have an elected legislature, but the Chinese side refused to elaborate on exactly how elections were to take place.
I did know that democracy was going to be difficult because I mentioned to the Chinese in December 1983 the likelihood that in the end, before 1997, we would have to have some directly elected seats in the legislature. And they nearly fell off their chairs. They said, this is absolutely out of the question.
The Chinese government has never been our enemy. We just want, see, if I look upon them as our enemies, I don't think I will stay in Hong Kong at all. How can I fight that enemy?
Democratic Party Chairman Martin Lee was someone who believed he could serve both Hong Kong and China. In 1985, he was elected to represent the legal profession in the Legislative Council, and in the same year appointed to the Basic Law Drafting Committee. The group was handpicked by China to write the territory's mini-constitution. Lee spent 4 years attending meetings in Beijing and Guangzhou. As the months passed, his frustrations grew. Martin Lee found he was a lone voice. He argued that Hong Kong should have direct elections for the Legislative Council in 1988. Fellow drafter and head of the Teachers Union, Sito Wong, was the only one who stood by him.
There was a coalition of political groups. I then joined them and talked about it and fought for the introduction of direct election for 1988. That's a starting point for me.
At that time, 190 pro-democracy activists formed the Joint Committee for the Promotion of Democratic Government. Rallies were held calling for direct elections. The democratic movement was born. Though the group lost their fight for universal suffrage, its course did not vanish. By 1988, the Basic Law Drafting Committee still could not agree on a blueprint for the Basic Law. The pro-Beijing camp was calling for a less democratic system. Pro-democracy groups took their battle to the streets. Signature campaigns were launched, a hunger strike staged. Grassroots professionals and academics later merged with pro-democracy activists to form the United Democrats. Preserving freedoms, human rights, and the rule of law was the basis of their cause. It was the student movement taking place across the border that brought many more to their side. Hong Kong people raised money to send thousands of tents and sleeping bags to students. Some even ventured across the border to lend a helping hand. By June 4th, their efforts proved futile. The crackdown shocked millions abroad, but hit especially close to home in Hong Kong. A million people took to the streets in Hong Kong to show their support for the Beijing students. Fighting for democracy took on a whole new meaning. Angry at the Chinese government, fearful for their own futures, pro-democracy activists marched side by side with pro-Beijing groups in the territory. Operation Yellowbird was launched. Members of Hong Kong's wealthy business community donated money to smuggle most wanted dissidents to the West. The years passed, the candles were still lit. Thousands turned up, determined those who lost their lives would not be forgotten. 8 years later, and the last June 4th before the handover, Hong Kong people refused to write off that fateful day as a chapter of history.
It's not a chapter of the history. It's the reality, because we do hope that the Chinese government will address the June 4 movement.
The Hong Kong people, they're going to continue their commemoration of June 4 because it is not only important for people from mainland China, it is also a big history event of Hong Kong.
The pro-democracy political groups joined together by forming the Hong Kong Alliance in support of the patriotic democratic movement in China. But with the handover drawing closer, would the future SAR government allow the people of Hong Kong to be the masters of their own political destiny? The Tiananmen crackdown united the democratic movement like nothing else had in the past.
That's Deborah Kahn reporting. Deborah will be back during our main news this evening, and we'll have another updates at about 3 o'clock.
By the First World War, Britain had established the largest empire in history, ruling 1/4 of the world's population. But after the Second World War, the people were awakening to a weakening protector, and they wanted independence. Dozens of colonies severed ties with the empire. Others fought for and won self-government. Only Hong Kong remained as it has been. Why? Were the British being selfish? Was it because Hong Kong people failed to fight for their own rights? In this episode, we examine the situation in Hong Kong, juxtaposing it with those in Malaysia and Gibraltar. Legacies of the days when Rule Britannia ruled the world are preserved in Britain, a testimony to the time when the British had more than 100 colonies in its empire.
They always thought they were better.
In the British Museum are tens of thousands of artifacts, the cultural relics of 620 million people on 5 continents. They attest to the fact that Britain once ruled 1/4 of the world.
The British being protectors against any other threats.
Once upon a time, wherever the sun shone, there was British territory, giving the empire the accolade of a nation where the sun never sets. Recently, the royal yacht Britannia sailed through the Strait of Malacca on its last voyage, stopping here in Malaysia en route from India to Hong Kong to retrieve the last governor. The Britannia is retracing a route taken over a century ago by British clippers through India, Malaya, and Hong Kong. These 3 places became the brightest jewels in the British crown in Asia.
I think all the European countries were going to try and widen out, and the British were very well placed to do it better than others. They didn't plan it, but they were in competition with other European countries, and it goes stage by stage.
This is a rubber plantation in Ipoh, Malaysia. 50 years ago, half the rubber produced in the world came from here, earning the government hundreds of millions of pounds. Britain had depended on local workers to exploit the resources of its colonies. To facilitate its rule, the colonial government did not interfere in the natives' daily affairs, unless they involved politics, and it provided education and basic amenities.
They provide education not because they wanted to see the people here educated, but a reasonably well-educated local population would be able to help in making the administration more efficient.
Everything decided for us, for your own good. That's what they say. I decide things for your own good. Of course, they brought law and order.
They made roads, they made railways, the postal service, the legal service. These were all the British system. They were doing all this for their own sake, not so much for us.
Britain ruled over 400 million people in its colonies of India, Malaya, and Hong Kong. In the early years, the people and their governments coexisted without much conflict. In 1939, the Second World War erupted.
War in the Pacific has been a bogey threatening the world for many years. The rich possessions of the Western powers are now in mortal danger.
In 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Washington and London declared war against Tokyo, bringing on the Pacific War. Britain's colonies in Asia became engulfed in the onslaught.
These are the first pictures to be shown of Britain's defences in Hong Kong, the Gibraltar of the Far East. Gateway to China, Hong Kong guards the interests of the empire in this distant corner of the world.
Such wartime propaganda raised hopes in the colonies that Britain could repel the enemy. But Japanese troops marching into Hong Kong took the colony in just 18 days. In the Malay Peninsula, British forces were overwhelmed even though they outnumbered the Japanese. In less than 3 months, all the 100,000 British soldiers surrendered. Japanese forces marched in as the British garrison watched, subdued.
There was this illusion of white superiority, white supremacy, and the ability of the British to protect the people. This illusion was dispelled, it was gone. It was a myth which was shattered.
In Hong Kong, British expatriates were evacuated before the Japanese arrived, but not the Chinese and the Eurasians.
When my sister and I applied for evacuation, we were just refused because we weren't 100% British. That hurt very considerably because those were days of deep apprehension in the city.
But whilst you couldn't be evacuated, the British administration here also expected Eurasians to defend the territory, isn't that true?
Well, all who held British passports or who were Eurasians joined up. But well, Britain had been at war since 1939. Many Chinese also volunteered. I was always surprised that more did not, because China had been invaded by Japan. Japan was the common enemy. Then and since, many have considered that was Britain's war. In fact, shortly after my brother was killed, someone said to her, "Why did your brother fight for Britain?" And my sister replied, "No, my brother fought for Hong Kong."
Lin Zhan was a teacher in Hong Kong then. She joined the resistance movement because she couldn't trust the British.
I did not think that the British would defend Hong Kong with their full might. Hong Kong is not their own home. It's just a colony as they called. When they like to stay, they would stay. When they like to evacuate, they would evacuate.
Lin Zhan's group worked with the mainland-based East River guerrillas made up of Chinese from both sides of the border. During the years of Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, they helped the Allies gather intelligence about the enemy. One former guerrilla, Lo Ao-fung, says the war had another meaning for Hong Kong people.
呢個作為戰爭嘅洗禮，使到好多香港人
個腦瓜清醒啲，唔會好似以前咁樣乜都要寄託到英國人嗰個身上。開始打個問號啦，呢個係咪可靠？在呢個3年零8個月當中咧，證明要靠英國人保護你冇可能，總係要自己保護自己。
The Second World War ended in August 1945. On VJ Day, London celebrated, but the war had tempered the strength and aggressiveness of the British Empire. After the war, the people of many colonies, including India and Malaya, began agitating for independence or self-determination. The masses took to the streets, staged boycotts at work and in school, and clashed with the police. Some nations rose in armed rebellion. They wanted to be rid of British rule. The empire started to crumble.
After the bluff of the empire had been called by the Japanese in the onslaught of late 1941, early 1942, the only way that the British Empire could restore itself was to go in with a new look, with a new deal. Things must change. The old system had failed. It had let the local people down and it had let the empire down. Something new had to be done.
That something new was democratic reforms, which Britain introduced in some of its colonies. London hoped that elections and local representation in government could ensure the continuation of British rule.
Merdeka, 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 Merdeka. It means independence. Merdeka, Merdeka, Merdeka. And shouting, whole country was shouting Merdeka. Get out, British, get out. British, get out. You want independence, you want freedom. So they knew it. They couldn't stay.
We are libertarians! We are not Spanish!
Even in Gibraltar, which remains a British colony, the people fought for and won self-government. Britain had taken the rock from Spain in the 18th century for its strategic value.
The defense of the fortress had long been the raison d'etre of Gibraltar, but it hit home the hardest in the Second World War, when anyone who could play no part in the defense, the women, the children, the old and the sick, were all evacuated to North Africa, Britain, as far away as Jamaica, leaving the men with their big guns. But what began as a strategic move evolved into a prolonged and agonizing separation of families and became the catalyst for local Gibraltarians pushed for self-government.
It was a long way, and we had to fight step by step. And we didn't want to ask for everything at the same time. We weren't going to get it. We got the city council. We fought for the legislative council.
10 years after the war, more than 50 colonies in the British Empire had won independence or at least self-government. Hong Kong also had a chance at democratic elections and even self-government, but it was not to be. We'll examine the reasons why after this break.
A day to be remembered. Pearl's motion picture premiere.
Little by little, with your loving care, with the Community Chest credit card, half of your annual card fee will go to the chest. And every time you use the card, 0.35% of what you spend will be donated to the chest by the bank. You don't have to spend extra to help those people in need. So get a Community Chest credit card now.
In August 1945, Japan surrendered Hong Kong to the Allies. British troops accepted the surrender in a symbolic display of continued British rule over the colony.
The
city of Hong Kong waits expectantly for the surrender to be made complete at Government House. The Commander-in-Chief of the colony, Rear Admiral Harcourt, arrives with Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser to accept the surrender. Outside Government House comes the simple and moving ceremony of hoisting the white ensign, while in the harbour below, the Navy gives a 21-gun salute.
During the occupation of Hong Kong, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang government had discussed with London about taking back the new territories after the war. Washington had backed the move, but later withdrew its support. Because of that, and the civil war he was fighting against the communists, Chiang decided to put Hong Kong on the back burner and ordered his southern-based forces to sail north via Hong Kong.
For the fighting men returning from a long and bitter war, a heartfelt greeting from their own people.
Residents cheered as 100,000 KMT troops marched through the streets of Hong Kong. To the British, this was a sign that one day the Chinese government would retake the colony. Several months later, Governor Sir Mark Young, who had been taken prisoner soon after arriving in Hong Kong, returned to his post. His first task was to propose political reforms to the 1.2 million people here. The proposals had been in the works in London during the war. Their aim was to plant a new impression of Britain in the people of Hong Kong, as well as of other colonies such as India and Malaya. Britain hoped that Hong Kong could remain in the empire. Sir Mark publicly declared,
His Majesty's government have had under consideration the means by which in Hong Kong as elsewhere in the colonial empire, the inhabitants of the territory can be given a fuller and more responsible share in the management of their own affairs.
The only way how Britain or the British Empire could keep Hong Kong British was to make sure that the people of Hong Kong wanted to keep it British. You could not do it by force of arms anymore. How do you make the people of Hong Kong want to keep Hong Kong British? Democratic reform. Give people the right to participate in the management of their own affairs, then they have a stake. And Hong Kong would also continue to provide good government, better government than you have seen in China in the modern period.
The proposals called for the establishment of a municipal council with some teeth to oversee Hong Kong's daily affairs, including fire prevention, urban development, and sanitation. Even the governor would have no veto power over the council's decisions. 2/3 of the councillors would be elected by the people. Also, the Legislative Council would have more unofficial members. The formula was to give the people the power of self-government. The government publicized the proposals in the media for consultation, but it seemed many people in Hong Kong couldn't be bothered, sending in less than 100 responses. Reporting back to London, Sir Mark said he believed few backed the reforms because people in Hong Kong were expecting China to take over the territory soon, and they'd rather sit on the fence than show any allegiance. In May 1947, soon after his reform proposals were unveiled, Sir Mark Young ended his term, and Sir Alexander Grantham took over as Hong Kong's governor. Major changes were occurring in China. Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang forces were on the retreat, and the communists were poised to take power. In Hong Kong, Sir Alexander amended his predecessor's proposals, effectively shelving Sir Mark's plans for reform. In April 1951, Sir Alexander wrote to London,
So long as the emergency persists in the Far East, giving Hong Kong people more immediate and material problems to cope with, there is probably no objection to leaving constitutional reform in cold storage.
Mark Young thought of it in that early period, immediately after the war. But then you had got the civil war in China was still continuing, and the KMT forces were retreating towards the south. This was not the time the local leaders advised to be experimenting with elections and so on.
Sir Mark Young's reform plans were dropped after 6 years in the pipeline. and Britain was slowly but surely realizing that Hong Kong was rather unique among colonies. In his memoirs, published in 1965, Sir Alexander Grantham wrote,
"The problem in Hong Kong is different from that in other colonies, for Hong Kong can never become independent. Either it remains a British colony or it is reabsorbed into China as a part of the province of Guangdong."
London was terrified because, but now we have a communist government in China. We're not talking about a corrupt government of Kuomintang, which was so ineffective that it wasn't much of a real threat. The communists were efficient, effective, powerful. They could infiltrate Hong Kong. So London procrastinated for a while.
On October 1st, 1949, the People's Republic of China was established. On October 7th, the People's Liberation Army advanced to Shenzhen. Many people thought China would take back Hong Kong.
英国人们也担心，我们会重生，过这个深圳河。当时这个解放军就接到命令啊，这个停止前进，是吧？到深圳就为止，是吧？另外就是在这个珠江口呢，也解放了一些万山群岛啊、珠江口的一些岛屿啊，都解放了。那么就是没有到香港去。
Actually, the Chinese communists had decided not to take back Hong Kong for the time being. And the British knew it.
The public statements going back to the 50s, making it clear that the position of the Chinese government was that the treaties were unequal, that Hong Kong was part of China, and that China would, in due course, when the time was ripe, recover sovereignty over Hong Kong. This was the background against which British post-war colonial administration of Hong Kong was carried out.
In the early 50s, the Korean War broke out. A US-led embargo was imposed on China. So, in a twist of fate, Hong Kong's status quo became vital to Beijing because it needed the colony as its window on the world.
他知道给中国动武大概不会有什么好的结果。按照中国的估计，他一定会拉着美国跟他一块来防守香港。那么在中国政府、中国领导人看来，那么与其叫美国取而代之，就是取英国而代之，那么占领了香港，这还不如继续留在英国人手里。
But for the next 2 decades or more, Britain did not introduce political reforms in Hong Kong, even though it had to consider ways to perpetuate British rule here, knowing that China was in no hurry to retake the colony. Governor Chris Patten said this about that period.
If Britain behaved in Hong Kong as it was behaving in its other colonies, that would give people in Hong Kong the impression that, like other colonies, they were going to become independent. And that was something, of course, which Chinese officials were very much against and which wasn't possible because of history.
But then, democratic reform was far from most people's minds. For soon after the communists took power in China, more than 1 million people fled the mainland to take refuge in Hong Kong, and they faced an uncertain future.
The people really don't know what happened in the future. Nothing we can do, only that we try to protect ourselves, try to practically make our better life. Life didn't give you any chance to thought about democracy. So-called democracy only so-called intelligent people maybe have these kind of ideas.
In 1952, Sir Alexander Grantham formally shelved his predecessor's democratic plans. That same year saw the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, the new ruler of the empire. But by this time, many of the empire's colonies had won independence or self-government. But Hong Kong, with the overriding China factor, remained under British rule.
If we introduced democracy and party politics in Hong Kong at that stage, when there was wave after wave of refugees coming into Hong Kong, the government wouldn't be able to get on with the job of finding a home, of creating a home for all those refugees. But by the mid-70s, when for the first time the majority of people living in Hong Kong had been born here, and when you were starting to see the development of an educated middle class, by that stage, there began to be pressure in Hong Kong for greater democracy.
A lifetime commitment.
I want to be married.
An indecent proposal.
I want your girlfriend for the weekend.
Can Nicolas Cage recapture the woman he loves? Honeymoon in Vegas, Wednesday night at 9:30.
In a fair competition, dirty tricks will not be tolerated. The ICAC will always be on the side of justice. Play fair, or you won't play at all. Hong Kong, our advantage is the ICAC.
Good afternoon. We hope you're enjoying our special program, The End of an Era. Hong Kong, abuzz today, now just 9 hours until the handover. People filling up in Statue Square to see the exhibits. Deborah Kahn now joins us live from there. Deborah?
Thank you, Chris. As you can hear, things are really beginning to heat up down here. Behind me, underneath the yellow banner, is where the Professional Teachers Union is holding a protest. What they're protesting against is that their elected members of the Legislative Council will be replaced with a provisional legislature member. As you can hear them chanting in English. And now to continue with part 3 on democracy. Although Hong Kong people were given the chance to vote in 1995, the pleas to uphold democracy soon did not last very long. China announced the fully elected legislature would be disbanded. The pro-China camp's battle started all over again.
During the months after Tiananmen, the focus turned from fighting for democracy to finding a way out. Hong Kong people wanted British nationality. British Foreign Secretary Sir Geoffrey Howe was greeted by protesters during a visit to Hong Kong. Show us moral obligation, give us back our rights, they demanded. But their pleas were shut down on the grounds the UK could not afford to grant several million Hong Kong people British nationality. With Hong Kong residents looking for a foreign country to take them in, the pro-China camp thought it was time to organize its efforts.
Now, we saw a big problem because we saw the wide gap that developed between the Hong Kong people and the Chinese government after Tiananmen. And in order for this one country, two systems arrangement to succeed, we knew that we had to sort of rebuild a working relationship between Hong Kong and Beijing.
Zhen Yat-sen was one of the founding members of the Democratic Alliance for the Betterment of Hong Kong. The party made up of pro-China unionists and leftists formed to give pro-China activists a greater say in politics. Although all parties were calling for democratization in Hong Kong, they could not agree on what pace it should come at. The Democrats wanted it immediately. The pro-China camp thought it should be sent at a slower pace. The Basic Law Drafting Committee was still haggling over the issue of how many directly elected seats the future legislature should have. Britain and China reached a secret deal. 7 secret letters were exchanged between the British and Chinese governments. Without consulting Hong Kong people, both sides agreed 18 seats were to be directly elected in 1991 and 20 in 1995. The announcement infuriated the Democratic camp and its supporters. Martin Lee and Sito Hua charged it was a breach of the joint declaration. The pair burnt a mock copy of the Basic Law in disgust. Hong Kong people got a chance to participate in the territory's first direct election. Less than 40% of registered voters turned up at the polls. But the United Democrats swept an overwhelming victory, winning 12 out of the 18 directly elected seats. The rest went to Liberal Party members and independents. The pro-China parties failed to win 1 of the 18. It was Hong Kong's last governor who decided Hong Kong people were ready for democracy. Shortly after Chris Patten arrived in Hong Kong, he unveiled his plans for political reform. His package was later endorsed by the Legislative Council. The voting age was to be lowered from 21 to 18, new functional constituencies added, and old ones expanded, and all district board seats elected. The Democrats once again swept a landslide victory, gaining the most seats won by a single party. The DAB ended up with just 7 out of 60.
The pace of democratic progress in Hong Kong reflects a sort of consensus between government and people. But one thing I'm absolutely sure of, and that is whenever you ask people in Hong Kong whether they want a bit more democracy or a bit less, they ask for and vote for a bit more.
If you remember, there was a lot of public recrimination and exchanges, and the Chinese said again and again, if you go on with this, you know what will happen. And
Sir Percy Craddock was right in thinking China would not just sit back and accept Patten's reforms. The Chinese government declared there would be no through train. The present LegCo would be disbanded by July 1st and replaced by a provisional legislature until the 1998 elections. In the months to come, China handpicked an advisory body known as the Preparatory Committee. Its task was to establish a selection committee, which would pick Hong Kong's future chief executive and provisional legislature members. The provisional LegCo was selected. The members were mostly pro-China, with not a single member from the Democratic Party chosen. An attempt to launch a judicial review against the Provisional Assembly by the Democrats failed. 70-year-old King Lung was granted legal aid to pursue the case, but a judge later ruled the case was doomed to fail. The provisional legislature held meetings over the border in Shenzhen, passing bills that would go into effect after the handover. Martin Lee spent much of the first few months of 1997 traveling abroad, vying for support from foreign countries. Meeting with the political elite from around the world, he told Western countries that Hong Kong needed their backing in its fight for democracy. Outspoken independent legislators collaborated their efforts for universal suffrage.
We are only in support of universal suffrage by one person, one vote. Any other method by limited franchise, we oppose.
The Democrats are calling on the future SAR government to amend the Basic Law to allow for direct elections. But the chief executive designate has already turned down the request. Although the Democrats will be ousted from law-making decisions after the handover, they have vowed to fight on.
Our strength lies in the people. The Hong Kong people have seen us, and from our track record in the past, that ours is the only political party which has consistently been speaking up for the Hong Kong people and in relation to the Chinese government.
Now, despite the rain, several hundred people have come down here to check out different exhibitions and participate in protests. I'll keep you updated throughout the day and evening. Back to you in the studio.
Thanks, Deborah. Later this afternoon, we will be live from Government House for the final departure of Governor Chris Patten. Stay tuned.
1950s and 60s, many Chinese living in Hong Kong still considered themselves transients, but that didn't stop them from taking to the streets to protest against colonial rule. At one point, riots erupted. So how did the British rule this borrowed place on borrowed time? Hong Kong today is an epitome of success, and much of it is due to a concerted effort to rebuild the ravaged colony after the Second World War in 1945, when Japan surrendered and Britain resumed its rule over Hong Kong. That same year, former Chief Secretary Sir Jack Cater arrived in Hong Kong.
When we looked around, electricity needed to be put on, water was not as good as it should be, streets were not tidy and so on, and the whole thing was very down at heel.
Another former top official, Dennis Ray, came to Hong Kong in 1950.
Our primary concern was with emergency relief, with poverty relief, with relief after squatter fires, with people who really had no means of earning a living. You know, we used to cook food and give it out. We had a relief camp where we could accommodate not very many people, but the few who really couldn't look after themselves.
Ray says the government could only help a few because it was strapped for money and resources. Why didn't Britain provide funds? Hong Kong is a British colony.
We never had any overseas aid. There was a small Colonial Development and Welfare Fund which did a little work in the new territories. When I say a little, I mean really little. But basically to help to finance public services, we never had anything.
Post-war Britain never regained its earlier supremacy. The empire was on the wane, with its colonies such as India and Malaya marching towards independence or self-government. Britain also tried but failed to push political reforms in Hong Kong. But as the communist regime took power in 1949, hundreds of thousands of people fled China for Hong Kong, more than doubling the population here to 2.5 million. Many of the refugees lived in cramped huts, but the government didn't have a long-term policy to resettle the newcomers.
No, this is a borrowed place, borrowed time. Even that, they try to keep. One day more is much better, one day more. Until the last day, they cannot keep. I didn't see any kind of long plan.
It had been the experience previously that when these massive waves of refugees came to Hong Kong, they didn't stay very long. So they thought, well, you know, give it a year or two, things will settle down, they'll all go back again. But if there was too much welfare activity in Hong Kong, you could simply get more coming in from China, where the conditions were even worse. But it began to be realized that 1949 was different.
Still, it took a great tragedy to spur efforts. In 1953, a fire gutted the Sheki Mei squatter area. Overnight, more than 50,000 people became homeless. These first structures of Hong Kong's resettlement program were Spartan concrete cubicles.
By today's standards, terrible. But by those standards of that time, they were no worse than the tenement buildings that people were living in permanent accommodation, and a good deal better than the wooden huts with tar paper roof in squatter areas.
The early post-war government was stereotypically colonial, as former Chief Secretary Sir David Akers-Jones recalled.
There were very few locals at that time, actually, in the senior ranks of the civil service. They were only literally a handful.
10 years after the war, there were still only a few Chinese officials in the administrative ranks. Paul Choi, Chang Dong-choi, and Li Fuk-kao. The Chinese were denied perks enjoyed by British colleagues of the same rank.
We may be very senior, but as locals, we were not given quarters. And at that time, we were not even given housing allowance. So we might be living in Wan Chai, Whereas our junior executive officers, if they are expatriate, would automatically be allocated a flat up the Peak or Albany or whatever.
Paul Cho was the first Chinese administrative officer. He rose relatively quickly to become the Secretary for Chinese Affairs. His son Lawrence cites an account of a dinner his father had with his colleagues at the time of his promotion.
They were speculating some other European